Honestly, Miles, could you be a dear and find out what that is? The voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly dismissive. It flowed like expensive oil from the lips of Julian Vance, a man who wore his position as the manager of Hawks & Company tailors like a second skin. Perfectly fitted, eye-wateringly expensive, and designed to make anyone else feel underdressed. He didn't look at the subject of his disdain directly, instead choosing to adjust the fall of a cashmere jacket on a mannequin, his reflection staring back at him from the polished mahogany paneling. Outside, the September drizzle did its best to wash the color from London. But here, inside the silent, hallowed halls of Savile Row, the world was a rich tapestry of cedarwood, beeswax, and old money. The only thing that seemed out of place was the figure who had just pushed open the heavy oak door, causing a small, ornate brass bell to chime a polite, almost apologetic announcement of his arrival. The man who stood on the threshold was Arthur Pendelton. He looked less like a customer and more like a ghost from a bygone era. He was perhaps in his late 60s, with a face mapped by weather and time, and eyes the color of a northern sea on a calm day. He wore a simple, dark wool coat, its fabric worn but meticulously cared for, the cuffs slightly frayed from decades of loyal service. He stood for a moment, letting the door whisper shut behind him, his presence seeming to absorb the sound in the thick plush carpet that swallowed footsteps and secrets with equal efficiency. His gaze wasn't that of a tourist, wide-eyed and impressed. It was the slow, steady, deliberate scan of a man assessing unfamiliar territory. His posture straight, his shoulders set, a silent testament to a discipline long since etched into his very bones. He held a flat, brown, paper-wrapped package under one arm, holding it with a gentleness that suggested its contents were precious. Julian finally turned, his movement a single, fluid gesture of condescension. He glided across the floor, his handmade leather shoes making no sound. His smile was a work of art, perfectly symmetrical and utterly devoid of warmth. "Good afternoon," he began, the two words hanging in the air, weighted with unspoken questions. "What do you want? How did you get in here? Don't you know where you are?" His eyes did a swift, brutal inventory of Arthur, from the sensible, rain-spotted shoes to the lines on his face, lingering for a fraction of a second on the worn collar of his coat. The verdict was delivered in a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. This man had no money. He was a waste of perfectly conditioned air. "Can I help you, sir?" The "sir" was a weapon, a poisoned dart of formality intended to highlight the chasm between them. Arthur met his gaze without flinching. The younger man's hostility was a familiar thing, a low hum he had encountered in different forms his entire life. It didn't anger him. It just made him feel tired. "I was hoping so," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble, quiet but clear. "I'm here to see about a repair." The scent of the shop was strong, a mix of chalk, steamed wool, and something else, something clean and sharp like cedar. For a fleeting second it transported him back, not to a battlefield, but to a vast, echoing quartermaster's store, the day he was issued his first uniform. The rough, scratchy feel of the wool, the smell of moth-proofing chemicals, the dizzying sense of a life about to be irrevocably changed. He could almost feel the weight of the kit bag on his young shoulders. Julian's perfect smile faltered, replaced by a mask of polite confusion, as if Arthur had just started speaking in a foreign language. "A repair?" he repeated, his tone suggesting the word was distasteful. "I'm afraid you might be mistaken. Hawks & Company is a bespoke house. We create new garments for our clients. We don't typically handle alterations for outside items." He gestured vaguely at the paper package under Arthur's arm. Behind him, at the far end of the showroom, a wealthier client, a Russian oligarch with a booming laugh, was being shown a bolt of vicuña wool by two fawning assistants. The contrast was stark, a piece of theater deliberately staged for Arthur's benefit. "This is our world," the scene screamed. "You are not a part of it." "I understand that," Arthur said, his patience a deep, unshakable well. He made no move to leave. He simply stood his ground, a gray stone in a river of silk and cashmere. "But what I have is an older piece, originally from this establishment, I believe. From a long time ago." He let that sentence settle in the quiet room. It wasn't an accusation, nor a plea. It was a simple statement of fact. Julian's expression hardened. The idea that this man in his shabby coat could be connected to the pristine, exclusive history of Hawks & Co. was an affront to the brand he was so carefully curating. He saw a problem, a speck of dust on his otherwise immaculate showroom, and his only instinct was to sweep it out. "I highly doubt that," Julian said, his voice losing its oily charm and taking on a sharper, colder edge. "Now, if you're not here to be fitted for a new suit, I'm afraid I have other clients to attend to." He turned his body slightly, a clear, dismissive gesture of finality. But Arthur didn't move. He simply shifted the package under his arm, his calm, steady eyes fixed on Julian's face, ready to state the simple purpose that had brought him here. A purpose that was about to bring two vastly different worlds into a collision that would echo far beyond the paneled walls of Savile Row. Julian's dismissal was meant to be a final chord, a clean end to an unpleasant interruption. But Arthur Pendelton did not fade away as expected. Instead, he moved with a quiet, deliberate economy toward the grand oak table that dominated the center of the showroom, a vast polished expanse where bolts of priceless fabric were usually displayed. The other assistants watched him, their movements freezing for a half-second, like deer sensing a change in the wind. Arthur placed his brown paper package onto the gleaming surface, the slight rasp of the paper a shockingly loud noise in the reverent silence of the room. He untied the string with methodical patience, his knuckles large but his fingers surprisingly nimble. As he folded the paper back, he revealed the contents. It was a jacket, but it was unlike anything else in the shop. It was a blazer of heavy dark blue doeskin, the kind of material that felt like it could stop the wind and the rain through sheer force of will. It was old, undeniably so. The fabric was worn to a soft sheen at the elbows and along the seams of the shoulders, and the rich navy color had faded to the shade of a midnight sky just before dawn. But it was also immaculate. It had been pressed with military precision, the creases still sharp, the lapels perfectly rolled. The blazer lay there on the polished oak, a piece of living history dropped into a sterile, modern world. On the breast pocket, the faint ghostly outline of a badge that had been removed long ago was still visible. But it was the buttons that drew the eye. They were brass, depicting a crown and anchor, but they were tarnished with sea salt and time, a dull gold against the deep blue. And on the right-hand cuff there was a noticeable gap. A single button was missing. Arthur looked up from the blazer, his calm, sea-gray eyes once again meeting Julian's. "This," he said, his voice even and low, "is a Royal Marines officer's blazer, made and sold by this house in 1978. He lightly touched the maker's label on the inside. A faded but still legible Hawks & Co., No. 1 Savile Row. I need a replacement for the missing cuff button, a King's Crown horn button, from the old stock. You used a specific type from a supplier in Sheffield." The level of detail, the quiet authority with which he spoke, momentarily wiped the smirk from Julian's face. This wasn't the confused rambler he had assumed him to be. This was something else. But the surprise lasted only a moment, replaced by an even deeper, more entrenched arrogance. Julian saw Arthur's knowledge not as a sign of a genuine connection to the firm's history, but as a pathetic, anarchic obsession. He stepped closer, treating the table like an operating theater and the blazer like a diseased organ. He didn't touch it with his full hand, instead using the tips of his index and middle fingers to delicately lift the lapel, his face a mask of professional disgust. "My goodness," he cooed, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You are quite right. This is one of ours. A museum piece, really." He let the lapel drop. "It is, however, a perfect example of why we've evolved. The cut is so heavy, so rigid. The modern gentleman requires something with more fluidity, more grace." He began to circle the table, warming to his theme, his voice rising slightly as he projected to the rest of the room. "Perhaps I could show you something from our new collection. We have a stunning Italian wool-cashmere blend, unstructured shoulder, half-canvassed. Something that would bring you into the present day, sir. A fresh start." The insult was profound, a complete negation of the life lived in the jacket before him. It was an offer to erase history and replace it with a fashionable, empty substitute. Arthur's expression didn't change, but a small muscle in his jaw began to twitch. He had endured freezing nights on windswept hills, watched friends face the ultimate sacrifice, and carried the weight of those memories in silence for over 40 years. All of it was bound up in the very threads of the garment Julian was now dismissing as a relic. "I'm not looking for a fresh start," Arthur said, his voice dropping even lower, yet it seemed to cut through Julian's sales patter like a razor. "And I am not here for a new jacket. I am here for the button." The simple, implacable repetition of his request was a rejection of Julian's entire world. It infuriated him. This old man was supposed to be grateful, or at least intimidated. He was not supposed to be resolute. Julian's professional mask finally cracked. His frustration boiled over into a performance of public humiliation. "Sir," he said loudly, and at the sudden increase in volume, the Russian oligarch and his assistants across the room fell silent, turning to watch. "As I have tried to explain, we are a forward-facing brand. We do not keep a dusty back room of spare parts for every garment made in the last century. We cater to a clientele that values the future, not sentiment." He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like tearing silk. "Frankly, even if we had such a button, what would be the point? It would be like polishing well, it simply wouldn't be a good use of anyone's time." In the corner of the room, Lance Corporal Ben Carter, who had been watching the scene unfold with a growing sense of dread, slowly lowered the sleeve he had been inspecting. His posture changed. The relaxed, off-duty slouch was gone, replaced by a rigid, coiled stillness. His eyes, fixed on Julian, were suddenly very cold. He recognized the blazer. He recognized the quiet dignity of the man who owned it. And he recognized the vicious, unwarranted nature of the attack. Julian, high on the power of his captive audience, was oblivious. He looked from Arthur to the blazer and back again, his victory seemingly complete. He gestured dismissively towards the door with a flick of his wrist, a final, cutting act of banishment. "Now, I really must insist. You're holding up the tape measure." He turned his back fully, leaving Arthur standing alone under the bright, unforgiving lights, a silent guardian over the old blue jacket that held more honor and history than Julian Vance would ever know. In the quiet, forgotten corner of the showroom, Lance Corporal Ben Carter felt a familiar sensation creep up his spine. It was a cold, quiet rage, a feeling he'd been trained to recognize and control on the windswept ranges of Limestone. It wasn't the hot, messy anger of a street fight. It was a focused, clarifying fury, a red mist that made the world seem sharper and slower. His hand, resting on the arm of the velvet chair, tightened until the knuckles were bone white. He forced himself to breathe. A slow, measured 4-second count in, a 4-second hold, and a 4-second count out. "Control it," a voice in his head, one that sounded remarkably like his old training corporal, barked at him. "Don't you dare lose it in here." Ben was on a pilgrimage of sorts. 2 days into his pre-deployment leave, he had taken the train to London for one reason: to have the trousers of his #1 dress uniform, his blues, professionally tailored at the legendary Hawks & Co. It had taken him 6 months of saving. To him, the uniform was sacred, and this place, with its centuries of history clothing generals and heroes, was supposed to be a temple. He had been sitting there for 20 minutes, soaking in the history, feeling a profound sense of connection to the institution he served. And then Arthur Pendelton had walked in, and Ben had watched his temple be desecrated by the very man entrusted with guarding its flame. From the moment the old man entered, Ben had recognized him. Not his face, but his type. It was in the unwavering posture, the way his eyes scanned the room without seeming to move, the profound stillness that separated men who had seen things from those who had not. Then came the blazer. When the old man laid that worn, dark blue doe skin on the table, Ben's breath had caught in his throat. He'd seen pictures of them in the Corps Museum, read about them in memoirs. It was a piece of history, an artifact from an era of hard men and harder fighting. His eyes, trained to spot details from 1,000 meters, had instantly been drawn to the breast pocket. He saw the faint discoloration, the tiny, almost invisible stitch marks in the heavy wool. It was a ghost, the shadow of a badge he knew as well as his own reflection. The commando dagger. The Fairbairn Sykes blade, the symbol that separated the Royal Marines from every other fighting force on the planet. This quiet, unassuming old man wasn't just a former Marine. He was a commando. He had passed the trials, earned the Green Beret, and lived a life that Julian Vance, with his soft hands and sneering smile, couldn't even begin to comprehend. Every word from Julian's mouth had felt like a personal insult. Museum piece, rigid, sentiment. Each syllable was a little drop of poison. Ben felt an almost overwhelming instinct to stand up, to walk across that plush carpet, and to explain in very simple, direct terms the concept of respect. But he was on leave. He was in civilian clothes. He was a junior NCO in a place where he was utterly anonymous. An outburst here would be catastrophic for his career. So he sat, and he watched, and he burned. He watched as the old commando absorbed the public humiliation without a single flicker of weakness. There was no shouting, no pleading. There was only a profound, unshakable dignity. When Julian turned his back, Ben expected the old man to look crushed, defeated. But he didn't. Arthur Pendelton stood for a long moment in the crushing silence, his gaze resting on the blazer. Then, with the same methodical precision he'd used to unwrap it, he began to fold it. Each movement was crisp, deliberate. A fold here, a smooth of the fabric there. It was the way a man folds a national flag, with a reverence that borders on prayer. He wasn't just packing away a jacket. He was safeguarding a legacy. He carefully wrapped it back in its plain brown paper, tucking the edges with a finality that spoke volumes. He had come here for something, and had been denied. But he was leaving with his honor perfectly intact. It was that act, that quiet display of immense personal strength in the face of such petty cruelty, that broke the spell of Ben's inaction. This was no longer about a rude shop manager. This was about the soul of the Corps. Arthur picked up the package and turned, his worn shoes making no sound as he began his slow walk toward the door. His retreat as dignified as an admiral leaving the deck of his ship for the last time. The moment was about to be lost. The injustice would be allowed to stand, evaporating into the perfumed air of the shop. Before he was even consciously aware of his own decision, Ben Carter was on his feet. The movement was sharp, economical. the sound of his boots on the hardwood floor just beyond the carpet a sharp rap in the silence. Every head in the room, which had been studiously trying to ignore Arthur, snapped toward him. Julian, who had already moved on to charming the oligarch, turned around, an expression of annoyance on his face. He saw Ben standing there, ramrod straight in his simple jeans and t-shirt, and a dismissive smile returned to his lips. "Ah, finally," Julian said, his voice oozing condescension. "Ready for your fitting now, are we, Corporal?" Julian Vance's question, sharp and mocking, hung in the silent, fragrant air of the showroom. "Ready for your fitting now, are we, Corporal?" He had clocked the rank on Ben's tailoring receipt earlier and had stored it away, a small, insignificant detail to be weaponized at his convenience. He expected the young man to flush with embarrassment, to apologize, to sit back down. He did not expect the answer he received. Ben Carter's eyes, cold and clear, met his across the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "No," Ben said, and the single word was like a chip of ice. "I've changed my mind." He took a step forward, away from the relative safety of his corner. "I don't believe this is the kind of establishment I want associated with my uniform." The challenge was unmistakable and utterly audacious. A mere corporal, a boy in jeans and a t-shirt, was passing judgment on Hawks and Company. Julian's face, for the first time, lost its mask of smug control and revealed the raw, sputtering fury beneath. His jaw tightened, and a blotchy red flush crept up his neck. "You don't what?" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "You have no idea who you're talking to. I could have you." But what he could do was left unsaid, because at that moment Arthur Pendelton, who had been the silent epicenter of the entire drama, reached the heavy oak door. His hand was on the brass handle. He was leaving. The sight of his intended victim escaping, combined with the fresh defiance from Ben, caused something in Julian to snap. All his calculated cruelty, his carefully curated image, dissolved in a primal need to reassert his dominance. "We are done here," he snarled, turning his back on Ben and striding the few feet to the door in 2 quick steps. He didn't shout. He did something far worse. As Arthur pulled the door open, Julian placed the palm of his hand flat against the old man's back and shoved him, hard. It wasn't a violent, theatrical push, but it was brutally effective. It was the kind of shove a bully uses to move someone out of his way, an act of pure, physical contempt. Arthur, caught off balance, stumbled forward through the doorway, his shoulder bumping against the frame. He didn't fall, but for a horrifying second, it looked as though he might. He caught himself, his old coat askew, and found himself standing in the gray, drizzling London air. The heavy door hissed shut behind him, leaving a stunned, tomb-like silence in the showroom. The Russian oligarch was staring, his mouth slightly agape. The assistants looked at the floor, at the ceiling, anywhere but at their manager. Julian stood with his chest puffed out, breathing heavily, his eyes blazing with a triumphant, ugly light. He had won. He had physically ejected the trash. He turned back to Ben, a vicious, satisfied smirk twisting his lips, a look on his face that clearly said, "You're next." But Ben didn't give him the satisfaction of a confrontation. He gave Julian a look so devoid of emotion, it was more terrifying than any threat. It was a look of cold, professional assessment, the look a soldier gives a target right before pulling the trigger. Then he turned, with the sharp, precise movement of a parade ground drill, and walked out of the door, leaving Julian standing alone in his silent, conquered kingdom. The cool, damp air outside was a relief, washing the cloying scent of beeswax and arrogance from his lungs. The genteel hush of Savile Row was replaced by the distant rumble of London traffic on Piccadilly. He saw Arthur a few yards away, sitting on the low stone parapet of a neighboring building. He wasn't looking at the shop. He was just watching the black cabs slide by, his package resting on his lap, his posture still straight, but with a profound weariness etched into the set of his shoulders. Ben approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. "Sir," he said, his voice quiet. Arthur turned his head, his sea-gray eyes showing no surprise. "Are you all right, sir?" Arthur managed a small, tired nod, just letting the world spin for a moment. Ben's jaw was tight with a fury he could barely contain. What he did in there, shoving you, that was out of order. He hesitated, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "That blazer. You served?" A long pause hung in the damp air. "A long time ago, son," Arthur finally said, his gaze returning to the traffic. A different world. Ben felt a surge of connection, of belonging. "Royal Marines?" he asked. For the first time, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even amusement, crossed Arthur's face. He looked at Ben, really looked at him, taking in the sharp haircut, the disciplined way he held himself. "You've a good eye," he conceded. Ben felt his resolve harden. "Once a Marine, always a Marine," he said, the old Corps motto feeling more real and true than it ever had before. He knew what he had to do. "Sir," he said, his tone formal, "with your permission, I'd like to make a phone call. I believe my chain of command needs to be aware of how one of our own has been treated today." Arthur looked at the young corporal's earnest, angry face. He saw the fire of youthful conviction, the unshakable belief in the rightness of the Corps and its code. He saw a reflection of a man he himself had been, 5 decades ago. He gave another slow, weary nod. "Do what you feel is your duty, Corporal." Ben nodded once, stepped a few paces away and pulled out his phone. He didn't search through contacts. He dialed a number from memory. It rang twice. "Duty office, Sergeant Davies speaking." The voice was pure Welsh Valley's grit, sharpened by 30 years of service. "Sergeant, it's Lance Corporal Carter." There was a pause. "Carter? What is it? You're on leave." "I am, Sergeant, but something's happened. You're not going to believe this." Quickly, professionally, Ben relayed the events, his voice low and tight with controlled fury. He described Julian's contempt, the mockery of the blazer, the final, physical shove. "The man he threw out, Sergeant. His name is Arthur Pendelton." Another silence, longer this time, fell on the other end of the line. When Sergeant Davies spoke again, all the gruff impatience in his voice was gone, replaced by something Ben had never heard before. A sharp, focused intensity. "Carter, listen to me very carefully. Stay right where you are. Do not let that man leave. I don't care what you have to do. Buy him a coffee, talk about the weather. Stand in his way if you have to. Just keep him there. I'm kicking this upstairs, now." The line went dead. Ben lowered his phone, the London drizzle feeling colder than it had a minute ago. He had just pulled the pin on a grenade, and he had no idea how big the explosion was going to be. The duty office at Wellington Barracks smelled of floor polish, strong tea, and the faint metallic scent of ozone from the humming servers in the corner. It was the functional, unglamorous nerve center of the battalion, a place of ringing phones and quiet, efficient procedure. Sergeant Ewan Davies, a man whose Welsh accent had been flattened but not erased by 3 decades in the Royal Marines, placed the receiver back in its cradle with a sharp, definitive click. He stared at the phone for a full 5 seconds, the report from Lance Corporal Carter replaying in his mind. An old boy, former officer, shoved out of a shop. Arthur Pendelton. Most calls from lads on leave were about lost ID cards or missed trains. This was different. This felt heavy. His gut, an instrument honed by years of service from Belfast to Basra, told him that this required more than a note in the duty log. Without a word to the junior Marine manning the radios, Sergeant Davies stood up and walked out of the office. His movements were economical, his boots thumping a steady, purposeful rhythm on the scuffed linoleum floor. Marines, young and old, instinctively straightened up or altered their course as he approached. a subconscious acknowledgement of the unwritten authority he carried. He didn't follow the chain of command. He didn't stop at the adjutant's office or the company commander's. He walked directly to a simple oak door at the end of the corridor, a small brass plate on it bearing 3 letters, R.S.M. He knocked once, a sharp, authoritative rap, and entered without waiting for a reply. The office of the regimental sergeant major was as immaculate and unyielding as the man himself. There were no personal trinkets, only framed photos of corps history, rows of leather-bound manuals, and a perfectly organized desk. Behind it sat RSM Alastair Davies, no relation to the sergeant, but a man cut from the same granite. He was the most senior non-commissioned soldier in the battalion, the living embodiment of its discipline, tradition, and fighting spirit. He looked up from a training schedule, his eyes sharp and intelligent, fixing on the duty sergeant. "Ewan?" he said, his voice a low baritone. "This had better be important." Sergeant Davies snapped to attention. "RSM, apologies for the direct approach. I've just had a call from Lance Corporal Carter. He's on leave in London." He relayed the report quickly, using the clipped, factual language of a situation report. "The manager of the establishment, Hawks & Company Tailors, Savile Row, has allegedly physically assaulted a former officer of the Corps. Sir, the name Carter gave for the officer was Arthur Pendelton." The name hung in the air. For a moment, nothing happened. The RSM's expression didn't change. The pen in his hand remained poised over the schedule. But then, a stillness fell over him. The sounds of the barracks outside, the distant shouts from the parade ground, the rumble of a truck, seemed to fade into nothing. The RSM's eyes lost their focus, looking past the duty sergeant, past the walls of the office, into a memory decades old. The air was thick with the smell of chalk dust, damp wool, and 200 young men. The hard wooden benches of the lecture hall at Limpstone dug into the back of a much younger Alastair Davies. He was a bootneck, a fresh-faced Marine recruit, exhausted and overwhelmed, trying desperately to absorb every word. On the screen at the front of the hall was a grainy black-and-white photograph. It showed a bleak, rocky slope, littered with the debris of battle. In the center of the frame knelt a young Royal Marine sergeant, his face blackened with camouflage paint and grime. His eyes, even in the poor quality photo, burned with an intensity that seemed to leap across the years. He was holding a water bottle to the lips of another wounded Marine. The instructor, a grizzled color sergeant with a Falklands campaign medal on his chest, tapped the screen with a pointer. His voice was a gravelly rasp. "Look at him," he'd said, his voice commanding absolute silence. "That is Sergeant Arthur Pendelton, 42 Commando, on the summit of Mount Tumbledown. The Argentinians hit them with 3 counterattacks that night after the main assault. 3. His platoon commander was down, platoon sergeant wounded. Pendelton, a 3-striped sergeant, took command of the flank. They ran out of ammunition and started throwing rocks. When that didn't work, they went down into the RG trenches and used their own weapons against them." He held the line. The instructor had paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the young recruits. "Gentlemen, when you are lying in a wet ditch, freezing your souls away, when you think you have nothing left to give, you will remember this picture. You will remember men like him. Sergeant Pendelton is the standard. Do not you ever forget it." The memory vanished as quickly as it came. RSM Davies was back in his office. The pen in his hand had pressed down so hard it had left a deep blue dot on the paper. His face was pale. He slowly placed the pen down, his movements precise and deliberate. He looked at Sergeant Davies, and his eyes were like chips of flint. "Ewan," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Get me my staff car. Have the driver bring it to the front entrance in 5 minutes. Then get the provost sergeant. I want him in his number 1s, full dress. Tell him to meet me at the car." There were no further questions, no explanation. An order from the RSM was absolute. The sergeant's training took over. "Sir," he said, his voice sharp. He spun on his heel and was gone. RSM Davies stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the parade square. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. The honor of the Corps had been insulted. A living legend had been disrespected, and he, the regimental sergeant major, was going to personally see to it that the matter was corrected. The minutes that followed the phone call stretched into an eternity. The London drizzle thickened, casting a grey, shimmering veil over the grand facades of Savile Row. Ben Carter stood a few feet from Arthur, a silent, self-appointed sentry. He had no idea what to expect. A call from the sergeant major, perhaps. A formal letter of complaint. He tried to make small talk, the awkwardness of the situation weighing on him. "Getting colder, sir," he said, his breath misting in the air. Arthur, who had been staring into the middle distance, simply nodded, his thoughts clearly a million miles away. He looked at Ben, a deep, abiding weariness in his eyes. "You don't have to wait, son," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This isn't your fight." Before Ben could reply that it absolutely was his fight, a sound cut through the gentle hiss of tires on the wet road. It wasn't a siren or a horn. It was a low, powerful purr, the sound of a high-performance engine that didn't need to announce itself. A single vehicle turned the corner onto Savile Row, and all other traffic seemed to instinctively slow down, to give it a wider berth. It was a Land Rover Discovery, but not a civilian model. This one was painted in a deep, lustrous Carpathian grey, polished to a black mirror finish that reflected the gloomy London sky. On the door, so discreet it was almost invisible, was the globe and laurel of the Royal Marines. The vehicle didn't slow down. It glided. It moved with an unnerving, predatory grace, pulling into the residents-only bay directly in front of Hawks & Co., with a silent authority that suggested the painted yellow lines simply did not apply to it. The engine cut out, plunging the street into a sudden, expectant silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's door opened and a corporal emerged. He was in his #1 blues, his movements so sharp and precise, he seemed to have been carved from glass. He ignored the rain, ignored the gawking tourists who had stopped to stare, and walked with metronomic precision to the rear passenger door, which he opened with a single fluid motion. From the vehicle emerged a figure that seemed to pull all the light and focus of the street onto himself. He was a tall man, ramrod straight, his face a mask of controlled neutrality. He wore the same #1 uniform, but his was adorned with the sash of a regimental sergeant major and the gleaming brass of a Sam Browne belt. A thicket of metal ribbons on his chest told the story of a life spent in the world's most dangerous places. Under his arm, he carried a polished pace stick, holding it not like a swagger stick, but like a scepter. This was RSM Alistair Davies. As he emerged, the passenger door on the other side opened, and the provost sergeant, the battalion's head of military police, stepped out, his presence adding a sharp, legalistic edge to the proceedings. On the pavement, Ben Carter saw the RSM, and his body reacted before his brain could catch up. He snapped to attention, his back rigid, his arms straight by his sides, his eyes locked forward. It was a pure, conditioned reflex. Arthur Pendelton did not stand to attention. He simply watched them, and the weary resignation on his face deepened. This was the one thing he had never wanted: a fuss. The RSM's gaze swept the scene. It passed over the gawking onlookers, registered Ben's rigid salute, and finally settled on Arthur. He gave the old man a single, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of rank, of history, of shared identity. Then, his face hardening into a mask of grim purpose, He turned his attention to the elegant, gold-leafed sign above the shop door. Hawks and Company. With the provost sergeant falling into step exactly 1 pace behind him, the RSM walked to the door. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried gait that was somehow more intimidating than any charge. The small brass bell chimed again as he entered. The polite, tinkling sound, a ridiculous counterpoint to the sheer weight of authority that had just crossed the threshold. Inside, Julian Vance was in his element, regaling the now fascinated Russian oligarch with a dramatically embellished version of his triumph. "Absolutely no respect for tradition, you see," he was saying, gesturing with a flute of champagne. "One simply has to maintain standards or the whole place falls apart." He heard the chime and turned, his professional smile already forming, ready to greet a new, wealthy client drawn in by the commotion. The smile froze, cracked, and fell from his face. Standing in the center of his showroom were 2 men in the most immaculate, imposing uniforms he had ever seen. They were not customers. They were something else entirely. The air in the room grew thick and cold. The oligarch put his glass down. The assistants stopped breathing. The quiet, refined atmosphere of the shop was shattered, replaced by a silence that was heavy, absolute, and terrifying. RSM Davies ignored the flustered assistants and the wide-eyed clients. He walked across the plush carpet, his polished boots making no sound, and stopped at the very spot on the oak table where Arthur's blazer had rested just a short time before. He ran a single, gloved finger over the polished surface, then slowly scanned the entire room, his eyes missing nothing, his expression unreadable. Finally, his gaze came to rest on Julian, who looked as if he were about to be physically ill. The RSM's voice, when it came, was not a shout. It was far worse. It was a low, calm, conversational tone that carried with it the chilling weight of absolute power. "Are you the manager of this establishment?" Julian Vance's throat felt as if it were packed with sand. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was bone dry. The question, so simple and delivered so quietly, seemed to physically pin him to the spot. All his rehearsed charm, his practiced snobbery, evaporated under the calm, unblinking gaze of the regimental sergeant major. He managed a pathetic, strangled nod, his head bobbing like a puppet with its strings cut. Yes, I am the manager," he stammered, the words sounding alien and weak in the cavernous silence. Is there a problem?" The RSM took a single, deliberate step forward. He didn't consult a notebook. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, devastating precision of a veteran sniper. "A problem?" he repeated, the words dripping with a contempt so pure it was almost a physical force. "Let's talk about standards. This establishment, Hawks and Company, has held a royal warrant. For over 200 years, it has had the privilege of clothing officers of the British Armed Forces. That is not merely a business transaction. It is a position of trust. It implies a shared understanding of quality, of tradition, and above all, of respect." He let the word respect hang in the air, a verbal guillotine. "Today, you took that trust, that legacy, and you spat on it." Julian paled, a sickly greenish tint spreading beneath his expensive tan. "I don't understand." "Don't you?" The RSM's voice was like chipping ice. "Let me be clear. A man came into your shop today, an old man, in an old coat. You judged him, you mocked him, and you dismissed his history as sentiment. You called a piece of that history, a piece of this establishment's history, a museum piece. And when his quiet dignity proved too much for your fragile ego, you physically assaulted him and threw him out onto the street." He took another step forward. Julian flinched, taking an involuntary step back. "The man you threw out of your shop," the RSM continued, his voice dropping even lower, "is named Arthur Pendelton." The name was spoken with a reverence that made it sound like a proclamation. "Perhaps that means nothing to you. To a man like you, a name is just a label you sew into a suit. But in the world of men, a name carries weight. And that name, That name is legendary. The RSM's eyes bored into Julian's. So let me educate you. The man you called a relic is retired Sergeant Major Arthur Pendelton, formerly of 42 Commando, Royal Marines. The museum piece he brought in was his uniform from the Falklands campaign. He is a man who held the high ground on Mount Tumbledown against overwhelming odds, a battle that cost good men their lives but secured a victory for this nation. His courage, his leadership, his character are still taught to our young Marines as the gold standard of what it means to be one of us. Just as the RSM was building to his final, crushing point, a quiet voice came from the doorway. "That's enough, Alistair." Arthur Pendelton had stepped back inside, Lance Corporal Carter just behind him. He walked slowly, not with the fire of a vindicated hero, but with the quiet sadness of a man who had seen too much conflict. He placed a gentle hand on the RSM's rigid arm. The use of the first name was a quiet intimacy that spoke of a shared history far beyond rank. The RSM stiffened for a second, then gave a single, respectful nod and stepped back, ceding the floor. Arthur turned his attention to Julian, who now looked completely broken, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. Arthur's gaze held no anger, only a deep, profound pity. "The jacket," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it filled the silent room. "It wasn't mine." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "It belonged to my platoon sergeant, David Morris. We joined up together as boys. He was the best man I ever knew. He was killed on Tumbledown, right beside me. His grandson? A fine young lad, just passed his selection. He's joining the Corps next month. I was getting the blazer ready for him. A piece of his grandfather he could hold on to." He looked down at the paper-wrapped package he still held. David lost a button from the cuff that last night. It always bothered him. He liked things to be just so. I promised him I'd get it replaced for him. Arthur looked up, his sea-gray eyes finally meeting Julian's. "That button, it wasn't for me. It wasn't about sentiment. It was about a promise I made to a dying friend 40 years ago." The truth landed with the force of a physical blow. The air was sucked out of the room. The story was no longer about disrespecting a hero. It was about desecrating a memorial. Julian made a small, choking sound, his face a canvas of utter shame and self-loathing. The Russian oligarch slowly shook his head in disgust. The RSM looked at Julian, his expression one of final, irrevocable judgment. "You are not worthy of this establishment's history," he said, his voice flat and final. "And you are not worthy of the custom of the men who make it." He turned sharply on his heel. He gave a respectful nod to Arthur. "Sergeant Major." Then he walked out. Ben Carter gave Julian one last, lingering look of pure contempt before following his RSM. Arthur was the last to leave. He looked at the shattered, weeping man who stood in the ruins of his own making, gave a small, sad shake of his head, and walked out into the rain, the bell on the door chiming softly one last time. The fallout from that rainy September afternoon was not loud, but it was absolute. There was no viral video, no storm of one-star reviews. The retribution was older, quieter, and far more lethal. Word traveled, not on the internet's chaotic currents, but through the discreet, powerful channels of the military establishment and the old money networks that still truly run the city. A quiet word from a general in a Piccadilly club. A suddenly cancelled order for 6 bespoke suits from a Russian oligarch. A discreet letter from the palace intimating that the royal warrant was now under review. Within 2 months, Julian Vance was no longer the manager of Hawks & Co. He wasn't fired in a blaze of glory. He simply vanished from the pristine showroom, his ambition and arrogance erased as cleanly as a chalk mark from a bolt of cloth. The soul of the old shop, bruised but not broken, began the slow process of healing. 3 months after that day, the doors of the Grenadier, a historic pub tucked away in a Belgravia mews, opened to let in a swirl of damp November air. The pub was a haven of warmth and history, the low-beamed ceiling stained with the smoke of centuries, the air thick with the smell of ale, wood smoke, and camaraderie. In a quiet corner, nursing a pint of bitter, sat Arthur Pendelton. He was watching the comings and goings, a faint, contemplative smile on his face, perfectly at home in a way he never could have been in the sterile perfection of the tailor's shop. The door opened again, and this time Lance Corporal Ben Carter stepped in, his working dress uniform immaculate, his eyes scanning the crowded room. He saw Arthur, and a genuine, relieved smile broke across his face. This was not a chance encounter. Ben, back from a hard and fast deployment to the Middle East, had made a call. He walked over to the table, and Arthur looked up, his own smile widening. "Ben," he said, his voice warm. "Sit down. You're looking well." Ben slid onto the bench opposite him. "You too, sir." They sat for a moment in a comfortable silence, the quiet understanding between them needing no words. "Heard you had a busy trip," Arthur said, taking a slow sip of his ale. Ben nodded. "It was educational, but I thought about that day on the row a few times. It helped, somehow. Put things in perspective." He leaned forward slightly. "I have to ask, sir, the blazer. Did you ever find the button?" Arthur's eyes twinkled. He reached into the pocket of his old wool coat and pulled out a small dark blue velvet pouch, the kind a jeweler might use. He loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into his calloused palm. Lying there was a single horn button, intricately carved with the old king's crown. It was a perfect match, a small, beautiful piece of history. Alistair Davies made some inquiries, Arthur explained. He tracked down an old armorer sergeant from 42, living up in Sheffield, had a whole box of old kit in his loft. Found it in a biscuit tin full of spares. Ben stared at the button, a sense of profound satisfaction washing over him. It was a small thing, a tiny victory, but it felt more important than any headline. "So the promise is kept," he said quietly. Arthur nodded, carefully placing the button back in its pouch. "I'm meeting the lad in an hour, young David. He's off to Limpstone in January. I'm giving the blazer to him then." The circle was complete. The legacy was secure. Ben shook his head in admiration. That manager, Julian, he never stood a chance, did he? He picked a fight with the entire corps and didn't even know it. Arthur looked into his pint, a thoughtful expression on his face. He seemed to be considering his words carefully. "The world is full of noisy people, son," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They get ahead by being the loudest voice in the room, by making sure everyone is looking at them. They think that's strength." He looked up, his gaze steady and clear. "But the real strength, the stuff that lasts, is quiet. It's in here." He tapped his chest gently. "It's about remembering what's actually worth fighting for. The noisy ones forget that. They're fighting for themselves." "We fight for the bloke next to us." He pushed the velvet pouch slightly across the table with his fingertip. "Promises, mates. Things that last." They finished their pints in silence, the hum of the pub a warm backdrop to the lesson that had just been passed down. Arthur eventually drained his glass and stood up, pulling on his coat. He placed a hand on Ben's shoulder, a firm, reassuring weight. "It's good to see you home, Marine," he said. Ben looked up at the old warrior, at the man who was the living embodiment of the ethos he had sworn to uphold. "It's good to see you too, Sergeant Major." Arthur gave a final, small nod and walked out of the pub, disappearing into the London night. Ben Carter remained at the table for a long time, staring into his empty glass, feeling the full weight of the quiet, powerful lesson he had finally begun to understand. The story of Arthur Pendelton is a reminder that the loudest voices rarely have the most to say. True honor, true strength is quiet, unassuming, and forged in the fires of promises kept and sacrifices remembered. If you believe we must honor the legacies of those who came before, like this video. Subscribe for more stories of quiet valor, and share this message so that true courage is never forgotten. Join us next time.